I had always been skeptical about ghost stories, dismissing them as nothing more than overactive imaginations or old wives' tales. But that changed when I rented an Airbnb in a small, remote town in the middle of nowhere. My friends and I were looking for a peaceful weekend getaway to disconnect from our busy lives. The listing seemed perfect, a charming, rustic cabin nestled in the woods with nothing but trees and nature surrounding it. The photos were idyllic, showcasing a cozy interior, a crackling fireplace, and a large porch overlooking the forest. I was sold immediately. The owner of the cabin, a woman named Sarah, was incredibly friendly and quick to respond to any questions. She assured us that the cabin was a perfect retreat for those seeking solitude and peace. There were no other guests scheduled, so we had the entire place to ourselves. She provided us with detailed instructions on how to reach the cabin, which was located down a long, winding dirt road. It was far off the beaten path, but that only made it seem more inviting. We arrived late in the evening, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The trees loomed tall and dark around us, and the only sounds were the distant chirps of crickets. We couldn't see much of the cabin at first, as it was tucked away behind thick foliage. But when we finally reached it, we were greeted by the sight of a small, weathered building with warm light spilling from the windows. It looked like something out of a storybook, a perfect, peaceful retreat. Inside, the cabin was just as charming as it had appeared in the photos. The fireplace crackled with a welcoming fire, and the furniture was vintage yet cozy. There was a lofted bedroom at the top of a wooden staircase, and the entire place had an old-world charm to it that made me feel like I was stepping back in time. It was exactly what I had hoped for, a peaceful, serene escape from the real world. That night, after unpacking and settling in, we decided to enjoy a few drinks by the fire. We laughed, talked about old memories, and shared stories. But as the hours wore on, I began to notice something strange. The house, despite its warmth and charm, felt off. It wasn't the atmosphere exactly, but rather a subtle unease that seemed to settle over me like a heavy fog. Every now and then, I could hear faint creaks from upstairs, soft, deliberate sounds like footsteps. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just the house settling. At some point, my friends decided to head to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stayed in the living room for a while longer, staring into the fire. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang from upstairs. It was followed by a soft voice, almost like a whisper, but I couldn't make out the words. My heart raced. I stood up, my mind swirling with anxiety. I told myself it was just the wind, or the house settling, or maybe even the trees brushing against the windows. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I called my friends from the other room, and they quickly came downstairs. Together, we cautiously ascended the stairs to the loft bedroom. It was pitch dark up there, save for the soft moonlight streaming through the windows. As we crept further into the room, we could see nothing amiss, no signs of disturbance, no strange presence. Yet, the feeling of dread only grew stronger, like something was watching us from the shadows. That night, we locked the bedroom door and tried to sleep, but none of us could. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the soft whispering again, like a faint murmur just beyond my hearing. It seemed to come from the far corner of the room, but when I opened my eyes, nothing was there. By morning, the tension had only grown. None of us had slept well, and the unease lingered in the air like a thick fog. We tried to shake it off, telling ourselves it was just nerves, but it was hard to ignore the strange feeling that something wasn't right. Over breakfast, we noticed a small detail. There was an old, worn photo on the kitchen counter, one we hadn't seen the night before. It was a black and white picture of a woman standing in front of the very cabin we were staying in. She was dressed in an old-fashioned dress with a solemn expression on her face. There was something unsettling about her gaze, as if she knew something we didn't. We asked Sarah about the photo when she checked in later that morning. She smiled awkwardly and explained that it had been left behind by the previous owners. They had passed away years ago, and she had bought the cabin from their estate. She didn't know much about the woman in the photo, but she assured us that there was no need to worry. Nothing had ever happened at the cabin. Still, the whispers continued that night, louder now, more urgent. It was as if the house itself was alive, and it was trying to communicate with us. I heard doors creaking open and closed, but when I went to investigate, there was no one there. My friends were becoming just as anxious as I was, and we all agreed that something was wrong. But by then, it was too late to leave. The road was treacherous at night, and we had no choice but to stay. Later that evening, while sitting by the fire, I noticed something else. One of the chairs in the corner of the room had been moved. It was subtle, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I stood up to examine it, and that's when I saw it. A set of small, dusty footprints leading from the chair to the staircase. Panicking, I rushed upstairs to check the loft. When I reached the top, I froze. The door to the bedroom was wide open, even though we had locked it before going to bed. I stepped inside, and the temperature seemed to drop. The air was thick, and the whispers were now unmistakable, louder and more frantic, like a chorus of voices calling to us from every corner of the room. And then I saw her. The woman from the photo was standing in the doorway of the loft, her ghostly figure translucent and pale, her eyes fixed on me with an expression of sorrow. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. I could feel her presence deep in my chest, a cold, suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. I turned and ran, shouting for my friends to leave. We didn't look back as we bolted from the cabin, not stopping until we reached the car. We didn't even care about the money we'd paid for the Airbnb. We just wanted to get as far away as possible. As we sped down the winding dirt road, I looked back one last time. The cabin was dark now, but I could swear I saw a figure standing in the window watching us leave. To this day, I can't explain what happened that weekend, but I know one thing for sure. We weren't alone in that cabin.
Next story.
I had always enjoyed traveling, and after hearing countless stories of amazing Airbnb stays, I decided to book one for a weekend getaway in a small town nestled deep in the woods. It was the kind of place that seemed perfect for a peaceful retreat, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. The listing for the house was charming. An old, rustic cabin with vintage furniture, a cozy fireplace, and a sweeping view of the surrounding forest. The reviews were glowing, with people praising the host for her hospitality and the serenity of the area. I arrived late Friday evening, the sky already a dark canvas filled with twinkling stars. The house was secluded, tucked away at the end of a long gravel road that wound through dense trees. When I finally arrived, the first thing that struck me was how quiet it was. There were no sounds, no cars, no birds, nothing. Just the whisper of wind through the trees. The air smelled fresh, damp, almost earthy. The host, a woman named Linda, greeted me warmly. She was in her mid-50s, with graying hair and a kind smile, her demeanor gentle and welcoming. She quickly showed me around the house, explaining how everything worked. The cabin was charming in its own way, with creaky floorboards and thick wooden beams overhead. A large stone fireplace dominated the living room, and a large bay window overlooked the forest. Linda pointed out a small guest book near the front door and asked me to leave a note when I left, something her previous guests had always enjoyed doing. "I hope you enjoy your stay," she said. "It's a peaceful place, but the woods can sometimes be unpredictable. Just stay inside after dark, and you'll be fine." Her words were strange, but I didn't think much of them at the time. I figured she was just being cautious, maybe concerned about wildlife or getting lost in the woods. The first night passed without incident. I made dinner, settled in front of the fire, and then went to bed. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise. At first, it was faint, like a soft tapping. I chalked it up to the house settling or maybe a tree branch brushing against the window. But then the sound became louder, distinct, rhythmic knocks like someone gently tapping on the wall. I tried to ignore it and turned over in bed, pulling the covers tighter around me. But the tapping continued, now accompanied by what sounded like faint whispers. I strained to listen, but the words were unintelligible, just hushed murmurs that seemed to echo through the room. My heart started to race. I sat up in bed, trying to calm myself. It had to be the house, right? The walls creaked. The wind could play tricks on you in places like this. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more unnerving it became. I glanced at the door, half expecting someone to be standing there. But it was empty, just the shadows dancing in the dim light. The tapping stopped abruptly and a heavy silence filled the room. I lay there in the dark, listening to my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. For a moment, everything felt still again. But then I heard something else. Faint footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere inside the house. They seemed to move across the floor upstairs, creaking with each step. My mind raced. I was the only one there, right? Linda had left hours ago, saying she wouldn't return until morning. I got out of bed cautiously, trying not to make any noise, my heart thudding in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight I kept by the nightstand and made my way upstairs, every creak of the floorboards making my pulse quicken. The footsteps stopped as I reached the top of the stairs, and I held my breath, trying to hear something, anything. But the house was silent again. I turned the corner to the second floor landing, but everything was just as it had been when I first arrived. I checked the doors, locked. No windows were open. Everything was secure. I convinced myself it was just my imagination running wild, the isolation getting to me. But when I turned to leave the upstairs hallway, I saw something strange. There, in the dim glow of my flashlight, was a large mirror mounted on the wall. Something wasn't right about it. The reflection was off. At first, it looked like my own reflection, but then I noticed something in the corner of the glass. Movement. It was a shadow, something lurking just outside the frame, something tall and dark, watching me. My blood ran cold. I blinked, and the shadow was gone, leaving only my own reflection behind. I couldn't stay in that house anymore. I grabbed my things, ready to leave, but when I reached the front door, it wouldn't open. I pulled, shoved, and twisted the handle, but it was locked. I tried the windows, but they were sealed shut, every single one. I was trapped. Panicking, I ran to the back of the house, desperate for any way out. That's when I saw it. The barn, just beyond the tree line. It was large and dark, and something about it called to me. Without thinking, I ran toward it, the sound of my footsteps pounding in the night air. When I reached the barn, the doors creaked open of their own accord. Inside was the unmistakable scent of mildew and decay. And then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A wooden chest, old and covered in dust. There was something carved into it, but the image was too distorted to make out. I approached it cautiously, my hands shaking as I opened the chest. Inside, there was nothing but a tattered journal and a series of yellowing photographs. As I flipped through the pages of the journal, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The entries were from previous guests, each one describing strange occurrences, unexplainable events that grew more sinister with each passing day. But the final entry was the most chilling. The house is alive. It watches. It waits. I am not the first. I will not be the last. The sound of footsteps behind me made me spin around, but when I turned, there was nothing there, just the oppressive darkness of the barn. That's when I understood the house was not just old, it was alive. The next morning, I left without even a word to Linda. I never went back to that place, and I never will.
Next story.
I had heard about Airbnb horror stories before, but I never thought I'd experience one. It was just a weekend getaway, a quick escape from the bustling city to a small house in the woods. A friend had recommended this place, saying it was peaceful, private, and the host was kind. The house, an old cottage, had a charming rustic feel in the photos. Wooden floors, antique furniture, and a large fireplace in the living room. It looked like something straight out of a magazine, and I was eager to unwind. I arrived at the house late on a Friday evening. The moon was hidden behind a layer of clouds, and the woods surrounding the cottage were thick with trees, casting long shadows on the ground. The road leading to the house was narrow, with only the occasional flicker of headlights to guide my way. I could feel the isolation as soon as I parked the car, a sudden tension that seemed to creep into the air. The host, a woman named Evelyn, had left the keys under the doormat as promised. I stepped inside and was immediately struck by the eerie silence. The house was cold, even though the heat had been turned on. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just the chill of the evening air seeping through the walls. I explored the house briefly, noting the old-fashioned furniture and the faded paintings on the walls. The kitchen looked untouched, as if no one had used it in years. The living room had a large bookshelf filled with novels and old journals. As I ran my fingers over the spines, I felt an odd sense of being watched, but I dismissed it as paranoia. After all, it was late, and I had driven for hours. I decided to unpack and get some rest, but as I made my way to the bedroom, something caught my eye. In the hallway, a small mirror hung on the wall, reflecting the dim light from the living room. It was cracked, but still functional. As I passed it, I swear I saw something move in the reflection, something out of place. I stopped and turned around, but the hallway was empty. My heart raced, and I tried to rationalize it as nothing more than a trick of the light. But that feeling of being watched, that unease, wouldn't leave me. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside made my eyes snap open. I kept hearing whispers, low voices that seemed to come from nowhere. I tried to ignore them, pulling the covers tighter around me, but the sound persisted, echoing through the house. By morning, I was exhausted, but I didn't want to let the strange noises ruin my weekend. I convinced myself that I had imagined everything. The next day, I decided to explore the woods behind the house. I had read online that there was a small creek not far from the property, and I figured it would be a nice place to clear my head. The trees were dense and the path was overgrown, but I followed it anyway, the silence of the forest amplifying the sound of my footsteps. As I walked deeper into the woods, I came across a small clearing with a dilapidated shack. It was old, its roof caved in and the walls covered in moss, but something about it drew me in. Curious, I approached the shack. As I reached the door, I hesitated. It was a strange feeling, like something was warning me not to go inside. But my curiosity got the better of me and I pushed the door open. Inside was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of decay. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the only light came from a small crack in the roof. There was nothing particularly unusual about the interior at first glance, just old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. But in the corner I noticed something odd, a small wooden chest, partially hidden beneath a pile of broken furniture. I knelt down and pulled it out, dusting off the top. The chest was intricately carved, with symbols I didn't recognize etched into the wood. It seemed out of place, too out of place for this decaying shack. I hesitated, but my hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside were old, tattered clothes and a collection of small trinkets, coins, necklaces, and what appeared to be a journal. I picked it up, feeling an odd pull as I flipped through the pages. The writing was in a language I didn't understand, but the pictures, drawings of eyes and strange figures, were unsettling. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that this wasn't just a forgotten chest. It was something much darker. I quickly shut the chest and stumbled back, my mind racing. I needed to leave. But as I turned to leave the shack, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The woods were silent, too silent. I looked around, but the trees seemed to be closing in on me. I felt trapped. The whispers from the night before began to echo in my mind, growing louder and more distinct. My breath quickened, and I bolted back toward the house. When I arrived, I was out of breath, my skin cold with sweat. I locked the door behind me, and as I stood there, trying to steady myself, I heard it, a soft knocking at the door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again. Knocking, slow and deliberate. I froze, my mind racing. It couldn't be Evelyn. She was supposed to be miles away. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The knocking stopped, and for a moment everything was still. Then the door handle began to turn. Slowly but unmistakably it twisted, the sound of the metal grinding against the frame sending a chill down my spine. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. The door creaked open, but no one was there. The house was cold again, colder than before. I could see my breath in the air as I backed into the corner, staring at the empty doorway. The whispers were louder now, filling the room, surrounding me. I turned toward the mirror in the hallway, and this time I couldn't deny what I saw. A figure, pale, thin, and distorted, stood behind me, its eyes hollow and dark. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. Suddenly, the figure was gone. The door slammed shut, and the whispers stopped. The house was silent once more. But I knew, deep in my gut, that something was still there. The next morning, I left. I didn't care about the rental fee or the reviews or the charming host. I packed my bags, got in the car, and drove away without a second thought. As I passed the shack in the woods, I couldn't help but glance at it one last time. The chest was gone. I never went back to that house. I never looked at Airbnb the same way again. Some places aren't meant to be visited. Some things aren't meant to be found.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a short weekend getaway, a simple escape from my chaotic city life. After reading glowing reviews, I found a charming, isolated Airbnb in a quiet mountain town. The house was nestled deep in the woods, with nothing but tall trees surrounding it for miles. The listing described it as a beautifully restored Victorian home, complete with antique furniture and original fixtures. The host, a woman named Eleanor, had rave reviews, and her descriptions of the area were welcoming and peaceful. She had even recommended some local hikes and nearby lakes, claiming that this was the perfect spot for rest and rejuvenation. When I arrived, the sun was just beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the trees. The house loomed in front of me, a 3-story Victorian with peeling white paint, large bay windows, and a wraparound porch. It looked like it had been frozen in time, like it had stories to tell, though it had clearly seen better days. Still, it had an eerie charm. Eleanor greeted me on the porch, her thin frame wrapped in a heavy woolen sweater. She was older, her face lined with age, but there was something warm about her presence, something that made me feel at ease. She explained the house had been in her family for generations, but she was the last one left. "The house needs people to fill it with life," she said, her eyes lingering on the building as if it had a personality of its own. After showing me around, Eleanor handed me a thick old key with a rusty tag and said, "The attic is off limits, but everything else is yours to explore." She smiled kindly before leaving, giving me a wave as she disappeared down the gravel path toward her car. I spent the first evening unwinding, lighting a fire in the fireplace and sinking into the plush armchair. The house felt strangely cold, despite the fire crackling. The air was thick with dust, and there was an odd smell, like stale wood and something metallic. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just an old house. Around 10 p.m., I decided to explore a little. The grand staircase led to a hallway with rooms on either side. The walls were lined with faded portraits of people I didn't recognize, their eyes seeming to follow me as I walked past. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I wandered deeper into the house. When I reached the end of the hallway, I noticed a narrow door that was slightly ajar. It led to the attic. I paused, remembering Eleanor's warning, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open, and a rush of cold air hit my face. The attic was dim, lit only by a small, dusty window that barely let in any light. As I stepped inside, I could hear the faint sound of whispers, like voices carried by the wind. The air felt heavier here, thick with history and secrets. I could see old furniture draped in white sheets, boxes piled high, and what looked like a large wooden trunk in the center of the room. Something about the trunk drew me in. It was old, intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. Without thinking, I knelt down and opened it. Inside, I found a stack of yellowing letters tied together with twine. They seemed old, perhaps from the early 1900s. My fingers trembled as I untied the bundle and began reading the top letter. It was addressed to Eleanor's great-grandmother, a woman named Margaret, and it was filled with strange, rambling writing about the house. "Do not trust the mirrors," the letter warned. "They are windows, not reflections. The house listens and it watches. If you feel its eyes on you, leave before it takes you." I felt a chill run through my spine. The words didn't make sense, but the longer I sat there reading, the more the whispers seemed to grow louder. They echoed through the room as if they were coming from every direction. My heart began to race, and I quickly shoved the letters back into the trunk. Suddenly, I heard a soft thud from behind me. I froze. Turning slowly, I saw something that made my stomach twist with fear. A mirror had appeared on the wall where there had been none before. It was a large, oval-shaped mirror, its frame dark and ornate. The glass was perfectly smooth, but as I stared into it, I saw something moving behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I could feel the air grow colder, the darkness thickening around me. I backed away from the mirror, my breath shallow and quick. I turned to leave the attic, but as I did, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection. A figure standing behind me, its face blurred and indistinct, but its presence unmistakable. My heart pounded in my chest as I bolted for the stairs. The whispers followed me, growing more frantic. I ran down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, but the feeling of eyes watching me didn't go away. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just my imagination, the house's creaky old walls playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I had felt it. The pressure, the weight of something in the air. and I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was not as empty as it seemed. The next morning, I packed my things, determined to leave. As I was about to head out the door, Eleanor returned. She smiled, but there was something different about her eyes, something too knowing. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with an undertone that made me uneasy. I didn't answer her. I just wanted to leave, to get away from the house and its unsettling presence. But before I could open the door, she reached out and gently touched my arm. "It's not safe to leave yet," she said, her voice suddenly cold. "Not after you've seen it." I pulled away from her grip, my pulse racing. I pushed past her and hurried outside, feeling the weight of her gaze on my back. As I looked over my shoulder one last time, I saw her standing in the doorway, a faint, almost imperceptible smile curling at the corners of her lips. I never spoke to Eleanor again. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear those whispers, and I wonder if the house is still watching me.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a simple, peaceful weekend away. My friends Sophie and I had been under a lot of stress lately, both dealing with work, relationships, and the general chaos of life. So when I found the listing for a cozy Airbnb cabin by a tranquil lake, I jumped on the opportunity. It seemed like the perfect place to unwind. The photos were stunning. A small wooden cabin surrounded by towering trees with a serene lake just a short walk away. The reviews raved about how peaceful the area was and how the host, a woman named Evelyn, was accommodating and kind. We arrived just as the sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the water. The cabin was everything we had hoped for. Small but welcoming, with a large stone fireplace and wide windows that framed the natural beauty around us. The air was cool but fresh, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. We quickly unpacked, and by the time we settled in, night had fallen. Evelyn had left us a note explaining that she lived in a house a few miles away and would check in the next day to make sure we had everything we needed. At first, it felt like paradise. We spent the evening cooking dinner and drinking wine, sitting on the porch and taking in the night air. Around midnight, things took a strange turn. Sophie and I were sitting by the fire, chatting about old memories, when we both heard it. Soft, rhythmic tapping. It came from the window behind us. We froze, staring at each other in confusion. Neither of us had been near the window, and the tapping wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate. Sophie stood up and slowly walked toward the window, her face pale in the firelight. "Hello?" she called out nervously. No answer. The tapping stopped. We both laughed it off, but the tension lingered. We decided to call it a night, heading to our separate rooms. Sophie took the bedroom with the large window overlooking the lake, while I took the smaller one at the back of the cabin. The house felt eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses on your ears, making every small sound seem louder. I was nearly asleep when I heard something faint, a whisper, like someone was trying to speak just outside my door. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. It was too quiet to ignore, but I couldn't make out any words. Slowly, I crept to the door and opened it, finding the hallway empty. I stepped back into my room, uneasy, and locked the door behind me. Just as I was about to lie back down, I heard it again, this time much clearer. "Help!" I froze. The voice wasn't Sophie's, but it sounded so close, as if it were coming from the other side of my door. I rushed out of bed and opened the door, calling Sophie's name. "Sophie? Are you okay?" There was no answer. I walked down the hall to her room, the air growing colder the further I went. When I opened the door to her room, I saw her sitting upright in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the window. "Sophie?" I asked again, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. She just kept staring at the window, her face pale, lips slightly parted. I stepped closer, following her gaze. At first I saw nothing but the reflection of the trees in the glass. But then I noticed something strange, a figure standing by the edge of the lake, just beyond the trees. It was a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by a dark hood. He stood perfectly still, staring directly at the cabin. A shiver ran down my spine. "Sophie, are you seeing that?" I whispered. Sophie didn't move, and when I reached out to shake her, I felt a chill in the air around her. Her skin was cold, too cold. I quickly pulled my hand back. Suddenly, Sophie blinked and looked at me, her eyes not fully focusing. I don't know why I'm here," she whispered hoarsely, her voice cracking. I grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her gently. "Sophie, snap out of it! What are you talking about?" but she only stared blankly at me, as if she didn't recognize me at all. Panicking, I pulled her out of bed and tried to get her attention. That's when I heard it again. The tapping. Louder now, faster. It came from every window in the cabin. I turned toward the window and saw that the man by the lake was no longer standing there. So he was gone. But something far worse had taken his place. A face appeared in the window, so close that it seemed to press against the glass. It was distorted, as though the person on the other side was twisted, half melted. But the eyes, those eyes, were black and hollow, staring straight at me. I screamed, dragging Sophie away from the window. The tapping was now coming from every direction, louder, faster, as if dozens of hands were slamming against the glass. "Let's go!" I yelled, pulling Sophie toward the door. But when I opened it, the outside was not as it should be. The trees surrounding the cabin had changed, twisted and contorted into dark, monstrous shapes. The lake, once peaceful, now looked black and endless, a vast void. And standing at the edge, watching us, were dozens of figures, their faces obscured, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold and judging. I slammed the door shut and backed away from it. The house was alive now, groaning and creaking as if it was breathing. "Sophie, we need to leave. We can't stay here," I cried, but she was no longer the person I knew. Her eyes were empty, like she wasn't there anymore. She was just staring at the wall, unblinking. Tears ran down my face as I realized we were trapped. I tried to make a run for it, but every time I reached the door, something would hold me back, as though invisible hands were grabbing my limbs. The whispering voices grew louder, more frantic, until I thought my mind might break under the weight of it. Then, just as quickly as it had all started, everything stopped. The house was silent again, the air unnaturally still. Sophie blinked, coming back to herself, but when she looked at me, there was fear in her eyes. "We need to go," she whispered. With no time to think, I grabbed her hand and bolted out the door. We didn't stop running until we reached the road, and even then, we didn't look back. It wasn't until we reached the safety of the nearest town that we finally caught our breath. I tried calling Evelyn, the host, to tell her what had happened, but there was no answer. I left a message, but it was as though she had vanished. We never spoke of that weekend again. But every once in a while, when I'm alone in the dark, I still hear the tapping.
Next story.
I had always loved the idea of staying in a secluded Airbnb. There was something about the thought of being alone in an unfamiliar place, far away from the noise of the city, that sounded incredibly peaceful. So when I came across an old farmhouse listed for rent in a remote rural area, I didn't hesitate to book it. The pictures on the listing were stunning. Stone walls, large windows letting in natural light, and rolling hills stretching into the distance. The owner, a man named Daniel, had a warm and inviting tone in his messages, and he promised a serene getaway with the kind of privacy I was craving. I drove out there on a crisp autumn afternoon, the road winding through dense trees and small, quiet towns. As I approached the farmhouse, it looked just like the pictures. Charming, but slightly weathered, as if it had seen many years pass by. There were no other houses nearby, just fields and the forest beyond. It was the perfect escape, or so I thought. Daniel greeted me with a handshake when I arrived. He was a tall, wiry man with kind eyes and a soft voice. He showed me around the house, explaining how everything worked. The farmhouse was cozy, filled with antique furniture and old wood paneling that gave it a rustic, timeless feel. He told me that the house had been in his family for generations and that he often rented it out to guests looking for a quiet retreat. "You'll love it here," he said with a smile. "The only thing to worry about is the weather. This part of the country can get pretty wild in the fall." After a brief tour, Daniel handed me the keys and wished me well. He mentioned that he'd be in town for a few days, but if I needed anything, I could reach him by phone. I assured him I would be fine, and he left with a final wave, disappearing down the gravel driveway. That evening, after a peaceful dinner, I settled into the living room with a book. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. As the night went on, I found myself glancing up at the old portraits that hung on the walls. There was something strange about them. Each one of the faces seemed to watch me, their eyes following my every movement. But I shrugged it off. It was probably just my imagination, the kind of thing that happens when you're in a place as old and quiet as this. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. The upstairs bedroom was spacious, with a large four-poster bed draped in faded linens. I turned off the light and pulled the covers up, hoping for a good night's sleep. But as I lay there, I began to hear a sound. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, like someone was walking around downstairs. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the house settling, but the sound grew louder. The distinct thud of footsteps on the wooden floor echoed through the house. I lay perfectly still, heart pounding, listening. I got up and quietly made my way downstairs, the creaks of the floorboards beneath my feet making my stomach twist. I reached the bottom of the stairs and scanned the dark living room. Nothing, just the flickering light of the dying fire in the hearth. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. No response. The house was eerily silent again. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do, but after a few seconds, I decided it was best to go back to bed. My mind had probably just been playing tricks on me. But as I turned to walk back up the stairs, something caught my eye, something in the corner of the living room near the window. It was a figure, standing motionless in the shadows. My heart skipped a beat. The figure was tall, indistinct, but it seemed to be staring directly at me. I froze, unable to move. My breath came in shallow gasps. The figure didn't move, but it felt as if it was watching me, waiting for me to make the first move. Slowly, I backed away, my feet feeling like they were glued to the floor. I turned and rushed up the stairs, my pulse racing. I slammed the bedroom door behind me, pressing my back against it as I tried to steady my breath. I didn't sleep that night. Every little creak and groan of the house sent me into a state of anxious alertness. The next morning, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow through the windows. I had no idea what had happened during the night, but I didn't feel safe in the house anymore. The figure, the footsteps, it all felt too real. I tried to call Daniel, but the signal was weak out here. I decided to leave. There was no way I was staying another night. I grabbed my things, packed up as quickly as I could, and went to the front door. But when I reached for the handle, I noticed something strange. The door was locked from the inside. I panicked. I checked every window, every possible exit, but they were all locked. I tried calling Daniel again, but there was still no signal. I was trapped. Just then, I heard a sound behind me, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the stairs. Slowly, I turned around, and standing in the doorway of the living room was the same figure from the night before. This time, I could see more clearly. It was a man with a gaunt face and hollow eyes, his clothes tattered and old. But his face, it was a face I recognized. It was Daniel's. Before I could react, the figure slowly raised his hand and pointed to the staircase. "You shouldn't have come here," he said in a voice that was cold and hollow. In a state of shock, I ran toward the back door and threw myself against it, desperate to escape. The door opened with a loud creak, and I stumbled out into the yard, not looking back. The farmhouse loomed behind me, silent once more. But as I reached the driveway, I heard one last whisper carried by the wind. "The house needs to be filled." I didn't look back. I drove away without a second thought, my hands gripping the wheel tightly, my mind racing. As I passed the last curve in the road and the farmhouse disappeared from view, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. But even now, I wonder, who was the figure I saw? Was it a ghost of the past, or something far more sinister?
Next story.
It was supposed to be the perfect escape. I had been overwhelmed with work, and when I found an Airbnb listing for a small cabin in the mountains, I jumped at the chance. The host, a man named Michael, had glowing reviews. His cabin was described as cozy, secluded, and ideal for unwinding. It was exactly what I needed: peace, quiet, and a break from my chaotic life. I arrived late in the afternoon after a long drive through winding mountain roads. The sun was setting behind the peaks, casting an orange glow over the landscape. The cabin was exactly as described, small but charming, nestled on a ridge overlooking a dense forest. There was a hammock in front of the porch, a fire pit, and even a few chairs placed around it. It felt like a dream. The air was crisp and clean, the kind of refreshing coolness that only mountain air could offer. Michael had left the keys under the doormat, just as promised. I let myself in, breathing in the scent of wood and pine. The interior was warm and inviting, with a large stone fireplace, rustic furniture, and large windows that gave an unobstructed view of the valley below. I unpacked my things, made a quick dinner, and sat by the fire, watching the flames crackle and dance. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional distant cry of an owl. The air seemed to hum with energy, but I chalked it up to the mountain wilderness. That night, as I lay in bed, something strange happened. The quiet, once soothing, started to feel oppressive. Every small noise, every creak of the wood made my pulse quicken. I couldn't explain why, but I felt as if someone was watching me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the unfamiliar surroundings. Around midnight, I heard a faint knock on the door. It was soft, almost like a whisper. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest. Who could be knocking at this hour, especially out here in the middle of nowhere? I didn't know anyone in the area, and Michael had said he wouldn't be around for the weekend. I cautiously got out of bed, my bare feet making soft thuds on the wooden floor as I approached the door. I peered through the peephole, but I saw nothing. The porch was empty. I opened the door, heart racing, and stepped outside. The cool night air hit me like a slap, but there was no one in sight. The only thing I could hear was the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or an animal brushing against the door. But something about the knock didn't sit right with me. It was too deliberate, too distinct. I went back inside, locked the door, and double-checked the windows. The unsettling feeling of being watched lingered, but I eventually drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I tried to shake off the feeling. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and I felt silly for being so spooked. I decided to go for a hike in the woods to clear my mind. The trail was well marked, winding through towering trees, and eventually leading to a small, tranquil lake. I spent the afternoon by the water, enjoying the serenity, but the unease from the night before never fully left me. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The hammock that had been neatly tied between two trees in front of the porch was now askew, hanging loosely on one side. I hadn't touched it since I arrived, and I was sure it hadn't been like that when I left. My heart skipped a beat. I approached cautiously, as if the hammock might jump up and bite me. There was no sign of any person or animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I made a point to lock every door and window again, but the atmosphere felt even more oppressive. The silence was deafening, and the air seemed to thicken around me. I sat by the fire, trying to distract myself with a book, but my eyes kept darting to the windows, expecting to see movement outside. At around midnight, the knock came again, soft but distinct. 3 knocks, spaced evenly apart. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced, trying to think of any logical explanation. Maybe it was an animal, I told myself. Maybe it was some kind of trick of the wind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I couldn't ignore the knot in my stomach, the sense of something malicious lurking just beyond the threshold. This time, I didn't go to the door. I stayed in the living room, the fire flickering in the hearth, casting strange shadows on the walls. I felt like I was being pulled into a trance, but I fought it, focusing on the sound of my own breathing. Then there was another sound. A faint scraping, like nails on wood, coming from the floor above me. I had checked the cabin thoroughly when I arrived, and there was no upstairs, just a loft with a low ceiling. But this sound was coming from above. I felt my blood run cold as I realized there was something, or someone, up there. I grabbed my phone and texted Michael, asking if anyone else was on the property. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me several attempts to type the message. His response came almost immediately. "You shouldn't be there alone." My stomach dropped. I was frozen to the spot, my eyes fixed on the staircase leading to the loft. The scraping sound continued, a slow, deliberate rhythm. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things, fled the cabin, and ran to my car. I drove through the night, the eerie sound of scraping still echoing in my head. I didn't stop until I was far, far away from that cabin. The next day, I called Michael to tell him about the strange happenings. He seemed genuinely surprised when I told him about the knocks, the hammock, and the noises from the loft. But then, in a low voice, he confessed something chilling. That cabin, it wasn't supposed to be listed. I told Airbnb I had it off the market for repairs. There's a history there. People who stay too long, they start to hear things, see things. It's been happening for years. I don't know how it got past the system. He paused, then added, "You're lucky you left. I never went back to Airbnb after that. I don't know what I heard in that cabin, but I know this much. Some places are never meant to be rented, and some things are better left undiscovered.
Next story.
I thought I was being clever when I booked a weekend getaway at an Airbnb that was far off the beaten path. It was a house in the middle of nowhere, nestled in a remote valley surrounded by dense forests. No neighbors for miles, no street lights, just solitude. Perfect for escaping from everything: work, stress, city life. I needed peace, and this place promised just that. The listing had a few oddities, though. The photos were gorgeous: well-lit, spacious rooms, wide windows framing spectacular views of the surrounding woods. But the host, a man named Richard, was strangely vague about the details. He didn't provide much information about himself, and the reviews, while generally positive, were brief. A few guests mentioned an isolated experience, and one or two talked about strange noises, but none of them went into detail. Still, I wasn't bothered. I wanted a quiet retreat, and the low price was an added bonus. I arrived at the house late on a Friday afternoon, just as the sky began to turn an eerie shade of violet. The gravel driveway was long and winding, leading up to the house, which sat at the edge of a large, overgrown lawn. The trees surrounding the property were so dense that they seemed to swallow up the light, casting the house in an unnatural shadow. The house itself was large and old, with dark wooden beams and a wraparound porch. It looked like it had been built decades ago, perhaps even a century. I got out of my car and felt the cool bite of the air on my skin. The house had an unsettling quietness about it. No chirping of birds, no rustling of leaves in the wind, just an oppressive silence. I felt a knot form in my stomach, but dismissed it as nerves. This was exactly what I wanted, after all, a break from the noise of everyday life. I found the key under the doormat, just as Richard had instructed, and entered the house. The interior was dark, the air stale, and the scent of something musty hung in the corners of the rooms. I turned on the lights, and the dim bulbs flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. The living room was enormous, with tall windows that looked out over the property, but they were covered in thick curtains. I opened them, and the view was breathtaking. Just endless forest stretching out in every direction, feeling like as if the house stood at the edge of the world. I explored the rest of the house, finding a large kitchen with old appliances, a spacious dining room, and a narrow staircase that led up to the bedrooms. The decor was a mix of vintage furniture, dark carpets, and old paintings that seemed to watch me from the walls. There was an unsettling vibe to the place, but I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that I was here to relax, to unwind. That evening, after I had unpacked and settled in, I decided to make a simple dinner and sit by the fire in the living room. The fireplace was a grand stone structure, and as the flames crackled, I felt myself relax. But as the night wore on, the silence grew more and more oppressive. I kept hearing things: footsteps above me, faint scratching sounds against the walls, and what sounded like whispers just beyond the edge of my hearing. I tried to tell myself it was the house settling, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Around midnight, the strange noises stopped, and I was left in an eerie stillness. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. On the far wall of the living room was a large, antique mirror. It was ornate, with an elaborate golden frame that seemed out of place in such a humble home. I had passed by it earlier, but now it drew my attention. Something about it felt wrong. I stood up and walked toward it, drawn by an inexplicable force. As I looked into the glass, I saw nothing unusual at first, just my own reflection in the dim light. But then something shifted. A figure appeared behind me in the mirror. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or my own mind playing tricks. But when I turned around, no one was there. I quickly glanced back at the mirror. The figure was still there, standing behind me, but now it was closer, too close. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I blinked, and the figure disappeared. I tried to rationalize it. It had to be a trick of the light. Maybe I was tired, maybe the reflection of the fire caused a shadow to move. But deep down, I knew I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I spent the rest of the night nervously pacing around the house, checking every door and window, locking everything tight. But the feeling didn't go away. The air grew colder, and the oppressive silence continued, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the sound of something faintly scratching on the walls. I woke up the next morning feeling exhausted, my nerves frayed. The house was still silent, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was lurking in the shadows. I needed to get out, but I had already paid for the weekend. I decided to spend the day out exploring, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. I spent the afternoon hiking through the woods behind the house, but the silence of the forest was almost too much to bear. There were no birds, no sounds of animals, nothing but the wind rustling through the trees. It was unnatural. As I walked, I noticed something strange, a trail of old footprints in the dirt, leading off into the trees. They looked fresh, but there was no one around. Curious, I followed the trail for what felt like miles, deeper into the forest. It was as if the footprints were guiding me, drawing me further into the woods. The air grew colder, and the feeling of unease returned, heavier this time. Eventually, the trail led me to a small clearing where I found a weathered stone well. The well was old, covered in moss, and as I approached it, I felt an intense wave of dread wash over me. The ground around the well was disturbed as though something or someone had recently been here. I quickly turned around and hurried back to the house, feeling eyes on me the entire way. When I returned, I found the front door wide open, despite the fact that I was sure I had locked it before I left. The house was colder now, and as I entered, the first thing I noticed was the mirror in the living room. It had been moved. It was no longer facing the wall, but angled in such a way that it reflected the entire room, including the dark hallway that led to the bedrooms. I could see something in the reflection. A figure standing at the end of the hallway. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as the figure slowly turned toward me. It was a woman, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes and dark hair that hung in tangled strands around her face. She was smiling, but her expression was twisted, unnatural. She didn't move, she just stared, as if waiting for something. I couldn't breathe. I stumbled backward, but when I looked away from the mirror and glanced back at the hallway, it was empty. The woman was gone. I ran out of the house, getting into my car and speeding off without a second thought. As I left, I looked in the rearview mirror, and for a brief moment, I saw her standing in the window of the cabin staring at me. Staring at me. I never contacted Richard. I never spoke to anyone about what happened. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never book an Airbnb in the middle of nowhere again.
Next story.
I had always been fascinated by the idea of staying in unique, remote locations. So when I stumbled upon a listing for an old mansion on Airbnb, secluded in the hills, surrounded by dense woods, I didn't think twice. The description made it sound like the perfect getaway, an antique-filled, charming home that had once belonged to an eccentric but renowned artist. The price was reasonable, and the pictures, though a little dated, were intriguing. I booked it for a weekend getaway, hoping to get away from the chaos of city life. The host, a woman named Emily, seemed warm and welcoming through her messages. She assured me that I would have the entire place to myself, and if I needed anything, she was just a call away. There was an unusual detail in her message, though. She mentioned that the house had a history, and though nothing sinister had ever occurred, some guests had reported strange occurrences. It sounded like a quirky, exaggerated thing that guests might say to add character to the place, but she assured me that it wasn't anything to worry about. The house was located a few hours from the city, at the edge of a small town. The road to the mansion was narrow, winding, and surrounded by thick forest. The closer I got, the more isolated everything seemed. By the time I reached the property, it was late afternoon, and the house loomed in the distance, a large, dark silhouette against the setting sun. The mansion was even more imposing up close. It was an old Victorian-style building with high, arched windows, a grand front porch, and an iron gate that creaked as I pushed it open. The place looked beautiful in a haunting way. Every corner seemed to be hiding a story, every inch covered in ivy and moss, as if nature was slowly reclaiming it. It felt like stepping into a different time, a time long past. Inside, the house was just as grand but felt incredibly cold. The grand chandelier in the entryway hung like a forgotten relic from a bygone era, casting long, eerie shadows across the faded wallpaper. The air was heavy, almost stagnant, and despite the temperature outside being mild, I could feel a strange chill settling over me. I noticed the house was filled with antique furniture, large, ornate chairs, old paintings that seemed to watch me as I walked by, and an overwhelming scent of wood and dust. It was beautiful, but there was something undeniably unsettling about it. I unpacked my bags and settled into one of the guest rooms on the second floor, which had large floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the grounds. The view was breathtaking. Tall trees, the garden, and in the distance, the deep, dark woods. I stood by the window for a moment, letting the quiet wash over me. As night fell, I decided to explore the house a little more. I wandered through the many rooms, all filled with furniture and decorations that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. The deeper I went into the house, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. There was one room at the end of the hallway on the second floor, its door slightly ajar. As I approached, I felt an intense chill, colder than anywhere else in the house. I pushed the door open, and what I saw inside made my blood run cold. The room was full of mirrors, large, ornate mirrors hanging on every wall. They were framed with gold and silver, their surfaces cloudy with age. But what caught my attention was the mirror at the far end of the room. It was much larger than the others, and as I stepped closer, I could see something in it. Someone. A figure standing just behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing. No one was there. I turned back to the mirror, my breath quickening, and this time I saw it clearly. A woman standing behind me. She was dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her long hair cascading down her back, but her face was distorted, as if a shadow was creeping over it. It was only for a split second, but I could have sworn she moved. I stepped back, my heart racing, but the woman in the mirror remained still, just staring. I quickly left the room, but as I walked down the hall, I could feel a presence following me, as if something or someone was right behind me. I turned, but the hallway was empty. I tried to shake the feeling, but the unease only grew. I went to the kitchen to prepare some dinner, trying to distract myself from the strange encounter. But as I cooked, I kept hearing faint noises like soft footsteps or doors creaking open. Every time I turned around, the house seemed just a little darker, a little more oppressive. As night fell, I decided to go to bed early. But as soon as I lay down, the whispers began. Soft at first, like the rustle of leaves in the wind, but then louder, clearer. I couldn't make out the words, but the voices were coming from somewhere inside the house. I tried to ignore it, but the whispers grew more frantic, as if they were calling to me, beckoning me to follow. I threw the covers off and rushed into the hallway, the darkness swallowing me as I made my way toward the source of the sound. The whispers led me to the same room with the mirrors, the door now wide open. The air inside was frigid, colder than anything I had felt before. I stepped inside, and the room was different now. The mirrors, once dusty and forgotten, were now glowing faintly, as if they were alive. And there, in the largest mirror, I saw the woman again, her face clearer now, her eyes wide and hollow, staring directly at me. I tried to back away, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. I could hear the whispers now, louder, all around me, and I could feel something moving, something coming closer. The air grew thick with an oppressive weight, and I felt as though I couldn't breathe. The woman in the mirror began to move, slowly at first, then faster, her hand reaching out toward me. I stumbled back, but it was too late. I felt a cold hand grip my arm, its touch icy and unnatural. Suddenly, I was jerked from the room, thrown back into the hallway. The door slammed open, and I found myself standing in front of the stairs. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in fear, but when I finally looked up, I saw Emily standing at the bottom of the stairs. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have stayed here," she said softly. "It's never safe for long." I turned to ask her what she meant, but when I looked back, the mansion had changed. The windows were covered in thick layers of dust, and the once beautiful paintings were warped, their colors distorted. I saw a glimpse of the woman's face in one of the mirrors, but it was gone before I could look again. I ran, grabbed my bags, and left in a frenzy, never looking back. As I drove away, I could see the mansion fading in my rearview mirror, its dark silhouette disappearing into the fog of the night. But I knew the woman in the mirrors would always be watching.
Next story.
I had always been drawn to places that were steeped in history, especially old houses. So when I found an Airbnb listing for a century-old mansion on the outskirts of a small town, I was intrigued. The pictures showed grand, towering architecture with large windows, an overgrown garden, and a touch of mystery that appealed to my love of old places. The host, a woman named Margaret, promised a quiet and secluded stay, claiming the house had been in her family for generations. She also mentioned that the house was rarely rented out, as it had been closed up for a while but was still perfectly safe. I arrived on a gloomy afternoon, the kind of day when the sky is a constant shade of gray and the clouds look heavy enough to burst at any moment. The house stood tall and imposing, its brick facade slightly weathered, and the large iron gates creaked open as I drove up the long, winding driveway. It was everything I had imagined. Beautiful, yet a little intimidating, as if the house held secrets it wasn't willing to share. Margaret was waiting for me at the door, her figure silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. She was an older woman with silver hair tied back in a loose bun and a gentle smile that did little to hide the weariness in her eyes. Her voice was soft and measured as she welcomed me inside. "I hope you enjoy your stay," she said, her tone almost apologetic. It's been a long time since anyone stayed here. The inside of the house was just as magnificent as I'd hoped. Dark wood paneling, grand staircases, and intricate chandeliers that hung from high ceilings. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and furniture polish. Everything felt still, like the house had been frozen in time. Margaret gave me a quick tour, showing me the living room, the grand dining hall, and the library, where the shelves were lined with dusty old books. When she led me upstairs to my room, she paused in front of a door at the end of the hallway. It was an old wooden door with a tarnished brass handle. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "This door. I wouldn't recommend opening it. It's better to leave it alone." I raised an eyebrow, but didn't press her for details. She seemed to want to move on quickly, and I didn't want to be rude. She showed me my room, a large, beautifully furnished suite with a four-poster bed, thick curtains, and a stunning view of the overgrown garden. Margaret gave me a brief smile and excused herself, leaving me alone to unpack. The first night in the mansion was oddly peaceful. I explored the house a little more after Margaret had gone to bed, finding rooms full of old furniture, some covered with sheets, others left untouched for years. But as I passed by the door Margaret had warned me about, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind it, something that didn't belong in a house as pristine as this. The next morning, Margaret was gone, having left early to attend to some family matters. She had arranged for a key to the house, so I was free to come and go as I pleased. But as I sipped my coffee in the quiet kitchen, I found my curiosity growing about that door. There was something in the way Margaret had spoken, almost too quickly, too nervously, that made me want to know more. That afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the door. The air around it felt colder than the rest of the house, and I could swear I heard something faint, like a low hum, coming from the other side. It was as if the house was trying to warn me, yet something pulled me forward, and before I knew it, my hand was on the doorknob. The door creaked as I turned the handle, the hinges groaning in protest. When I stepped inside, I was hit with a strange mixture of dust and stale air. The room was pitch black, and it took me a moment to adjust to the darkness. I fumbled around, finding the light switch on the wall. As the light flickered on, I gasped. The room was not a bedroom or a storage space like I had expected. It was a small, cramped study, its walls lined with shelves filled with books and old artifacts. But the real shock came when my eyes fell on the desk in the center of the room. It was covered in papers, all neatly stacked, but in the middle of the desk was a large, open journal. The pages were yellowed with age, but the ink was still fresh, as though it had been written only yesterday. I moved closer to the desk, my heart pounding as I began to read. November 3rd, 1921. The house is awake again. I can hear it calling to me, its whispers growing louder. I thought it was a trick of the wind, but the more I ignore it, the stronger the pull. I must find out what it wants. I turned the page. November 4th, 1921. I'm not alone here. I can feel its eyes on me, watching me. The house remembers me. It remembers us all. I shuddered, my hands trembling as I closed the journal. I couldn't make sense of it. The house, what did it mean by us all? I looked around the room, feeling a sudden chill. It was as if the very walls were closing in on me. I heard the creak of footsteps behind me, and I turned to see Margaret standing in the doorway, her face pale and tight with fear. I told you not to open that door, she whispered, her voice trembling. The house has memories, and it doesn't forget. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could say anything, she stepped forward and placed a hand on my shoulder. Her touch was icy cold. "The house doesn't let go of its secrets," she said softly, almost mournfully. "And it doesn't like strangers. It never has." Her words hung in the air as I stood frozen, staring at the journal on the desk. Margaret's eyes flickered toward it, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something almost pleading in her gaze. She took a step back, as if suddenly aware of what I had uncovered. "Leave. Now," she urged. "Before it gets you to." I didn't question her again. I grabbed my things and hurried out of the room, the sense of urgency in my steps growing with each passing second. I left the house without a second glance, the door slamming behind me as I fled into the cold night. As I drove away, I glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the silhouette of the mansion in the distance. But there was nothing, just the dark road ahead.